Chapter 2. Slick cobblestones hushed Mateo's boots as he slipped down a darkened road in the heart of Necci, the old city by the sea. He clung to the buildings to stay out of sight. Only the occasional torchlight from a porch or the sad flicker of a candle softened the air. The stars overhead illuminated the night sky. It was the third month of summer. Fall would be here soon, and more desperate days would follow. He stopped, stared at the sky for a breath or two, and kept going. Vittoria was walking home from a lavanda job at a men's tailoring shop. Like all workers, her wooden shoes thumped on the ground, and she walked with a metal pipe in her left hand. Her eyes darted around, wisely watchful, but she didn't seem frightened. Her neck was taut, but without panic. Here was a woman used to the violent streets. Good. With a graceful neck like that, she needed to be aware. Mateo kept an eye on her as she curved around to check her back. He was hidden behind a spell and wouldn't be noticed. She stopped on the left side of the road, near several broken crates and a pile of decayed food. Landowners didn't come this far, so the utilitarian cleanliness of the streets had waned. Mateo paused. She rapped on a wooden door leading to a ramshackle 2-story building built for a small family of 4. Most buildings in this part of Necci had been abandoned and left to die, but the workers had filled them quickly. Instead of 4, it likely housed 15. Maybe fewer now that witches seemed to be disappearing off the streets, fleeing to the protection of the rebels more than ever. He stilled, breath held. Her white-knuckled grip on the pipe hadn't eased as she waited for someone to answer her summons. Clearly, Vittoria was distracted by something. He didn't like that. It wasn't safe, particularly not in the Necci coven, even with the watchful gaze of La Tourere overhead. A woman as beautiful as Vittoria couldn't afford a single lapse of attention in a world like this. A young girl answered the timid knock. The two of them murmured back and forth for a minute. Keeping his eyes on the shadows across the road, Mateo used a simple spell that made it easier to hear the conversation. "Any work?" Vittoria asked. "Not tomorrow. Maybe the next day." A sigh. "Do you know of any other places that need help?" "No. The rebel riots against the landowner shops near the Samsa coven have left many women upended. Lavanda maids are so available that some have offered to work for half portions of food." Mateo frowned. Troublesome. The rebels had been escalating their insurgency tactics against the landowners for weeks now. Riots made their situation worse in most ways, although he could understand the burning need to be heard at any cost. But the fractured rebel groups weren't working together anymore. Not that he could tell, anyway. Unfortunately, innocents like Vittoria bore the brunt of the consequences. "Thank you," Vittoria said. "Do you have enough to eat? I stumbled into some extras. I would be happy to share." Mateo's head cocked to the side. How had she made it to this age with such a disposition? There was no room for softness as a worker. 4 days ago, he'd walked by a dress shop and heard her argument with a notoriously difficult Andrea. The food bucket had been easy to send. What startled him was seeing her, not 5 minutes after he'd used a spell to put the bucket there, giving over half of it away. Nothing could have shocked him more. So he'd followed her, watched her go home, attend to a neighbor, play with a little boy. She was quiet, lovely Grace. And that's when he'd had the best idea of his life. It had taken all night to truly contemplate the idea, to think to the end of it and back, the ramifications, the negatives. He'd driven his men mad as he paced, talked it out, and dreamed up the ending. Now, 4 days later, he'd given her 4 buckets. And every day she'd done the same thing, kept half, given the rest away. The other girl accepted Vittoria's offer of food with a grateful smile. "Thank you, Mattia. We did not have work today. May la principessa bless you." They exchanged a kiss of each cheek, and Vittoria stepped back. She pulled a shawl more closely around her shoulders, glanced around, and kept walking. If he counted correctly, she'd just given away the last of the food. Her shoulders sank a bit lower now. Dejection about the lack of work, perhaps? He studied her as he followed, intrigued beyond words. A shadow moved out of an alley just as Vittoria passed, male, if the broad shoulders meant anything. There was a bit of swagger in his steps as he stumbled closer to her. Laid off, likely. The talentless died in their own wallow these days. Even on a busy side road, which this one wasn't, Vittoria could get pulled away. The alleys of Necci were dark and plentiful. Most workers didn't bother to listen or help anymore, too entrenched in their own misery. 2 quick strides, and Mateo caught up to the witch. A hand on the back of his neck, a growl of warning, and a flick of his wrist left the attacker lying in a pile of dank, moldering rubbish. The witch groaned and then passed out. Vittoria, knuckles white on her metal pipe, glanced over her shoulder in the vague direction of the witch. Seeing nothing of concern, she turned warily back around. She headed away from the city center and toward the Mayfair Coven. It was quieter there, more residential, with fewer hidden Ipsum taverns and less desperation. But it was on the other side of the city. The farther away from the landowner shops, the less the guardians patrolled. In the outer rings of Necci, refugees from the farms and country were forced to work and live in close quarters. Chaos abounded. For the 4th time, he followed her, just in case. Rats peeked out of the refuse, scurrying boldly over piles of excrement and slipping into the walls. Vittoria kept her pipe at the ready. 15 minutes later, she slowed in front of a door, glanced around, and slipped inside. Her house. He paused a moment, made sure she remained safe inside, then transported to a different part of Necci. Wind brushed against his face as he stood high facing Samsa Coven, on top of the Elixir of the giver La Principessa. Lights from Magnolia Castle flickered to the south. Beyond, the ocean curled in blue waves. Screams, laughter, and sobs alternated from below, threaded with cries of, La Principessa! La Principessa, indeed. Mateo's thoughts turned over Vittoria as he stared at the city. A shuffle of feet, and the sound of someone else breathing, joined him. Mateo removed his invisibility spell and looked to his left. A tall, broad-shouldered man appeared. He had dark hair shorn close to his head and a goatee around his lips. Muscles rippled along his arms, intensifying the serious expression on his pockmarked face. He was 50-something years old, ancient for a worker, with the wrinkles to prove it. "Benat," Mateo said. "Majesty." Mateo rolled his eyes, but said nothing. "Your night with the young woman was successful?" Benat asked. With ham-like fingers, he gripped the railing that encircled the top of the Elixir. Magnolia flowers cascaded off the top of the wall, their smell lightening the air. They were spells, flowers enchanted to live through anything. Mare had put them there a decade ago, at least. Mateo nodded. "Another bucket given, another bucket distributed." "She's consistent." "So far. The question is whether she'll continue to share what we give her, and if she does, for how long. We may give her resources for a long time. Maybe she'll start to hoard. Maybe she'll get comfortable and stop sharing. Maybe." He let his own thoughts trail off. But not grunted. "You don't have forever to play this game." "I don't need forever. Just a few months of her doing what she clearly does so naturally. Père is ill, but not yet dying. If Vittoria proves to be the right witch, we have a real chance." "Your plan is wild." Mateo laughed. "It is, and it's the only way. The only thing that neither Père nor Romeo would anticipate." "She's a lavanda maid." "No one better." Sobs came from below again, so Mateo initiated his favorite magic, Sarterin, which was still unknown among Hode's magic-seeking guardians. Using magic that the guardians weren't trained to feel, hear, or sense gave them ample opportunity to help workers but remain undetected. It was time to get to work. "Your men are in place, I presume?" Benat straightened, clearly eager to get to their nightly rounds. "Yes, Majesty. They wait below." "Then let us give justice in the name of La Salvatorra tonight. Tomorrow, I speak with my Père and Romeo," he said brightly, "and who knows if I'll even live through it." Benat snorted. "For honor," he said with a thump of his chest. Mateo grinned. "For honor." 3 days later, Mateo regarded a bloody slash across his forearm with a narrowed gaze. It was deep enough to bleed, but shouldn't need to be stitched closed. High chance of infection, though. Perfect. Twilight fell around him. He stood on the outskirts of the landowner coven and carefully watched the basement windows of the lavanda in a bustling house. This landowner, Moretti, was famous for his elegant hospitality and extravagant parties. Landowners all over the Eastern Network came to his mansion in Necci for his lavish balls and dinners. So many witches meant big crowds. Big crowds meant a lot of bed linens, tablecloths, servants' clothes, and silk napkins to launder, which meant Vittoria was fast at work today. She'd been up earlier than usual this morning, before the first hint of dawn. Her mare worked at the Moretti house in some capacity he hadn't figured out yet, which was likely how Vittoria had known there'd be work today. They'd walked here together, and Vittoria had arrived minutes before a rush of other lavanda maids desperate for food. Since lavanda maids weren't conscripted, they had to grope for work every day. Brutal. He'd spent the last 3 days invisibly walking Vittoria to and from work to ensure her safety. Word had spread rapidly regarding her generosity. A few witches watched for her now, this elegant witch in a hopeless world. She gave food, laughter, or help to everyone. Today, he'd finally speak with her. She wouldn't know him. Not yet, anyway. He wanted to introduce himself as La Salvatorra, the witch who had given her food buckets for the last 7 days. But now wasn't the time. He had to prove her out still. Could she actually change the world? His face warmed again, then slowly cooled. His belly grew in girth, his shirt tightening around him. The rotating transformative magic that he used as La Salvatorra shifted every few minutes, changing his appearance from head to toe, which made him impossible to track in a crowd. He stopped the magic, an ancient one he'd found in a century-old grimoire, Caken's or something like that, obsessed with transforming themselves and the mortal enemies of the Kudins. Didn't matter, because the magic wasn't inert, despite being out of use. No one else knew of it, which was an edge he needed against landowners obsessed with honor and magic. Instead, he used a basic transformation spell. His usually wide shoulders narrowed, and his towering height shrank so he'd be no taller than Vittoria. His thick black hair that fell to his shoulders shortened. His hazel eyes turned muddy brown, and his face rounded out slightly. Thankfully, the magic didn't hurt. Was mere illusion. Over time, it did drain his energy to maintain. Like a muscle, magical power could be built and strengthened. He'd become quite powerful with magic over the years, thanks to his constant use of it as La Salvatorra. Once the transformation was complete, he stepped into the street. Landowner streets were wider, built with cobblestones and made to last, unlike the dirt roads in the covens of Necci. On either side of the streets were lawns and gardens and the elegant mansions that lay behind them. Every landowner house had one side that backed up to a less conspicuous street to allow the workers quiet access. No givers adorned the walls here, making this coven less visually cluttered than those in North Necci, where workers sketched their givers with charcoal on every surface. Mateo crossed the road and knocked on the lavanda door. Seconds later, it creaked open. Vittoria peered out, her hazel eyes reserved. She wore a cream-colored dress underneath an emerald overlayer that protected her clothes from potions. Her hair was pulled away from her face in a loose braid, although a few tendrils escaped. She took his breath away every time. Up close was no different. With her heart-shaped face, pert nose, and full lips, she was thin but not yet deathly so. Somehow, her family seemed to work together and eke out a living in a world where many dwindled in their own despair. That despair was why La Principessa was considered the most powerful giver of all. She offered hope. Sa. He dropped his head slightly. I have heard you are a healer. She straightened. I'm a lavanda maid, not a healer. But you have a reputation for helping workers, and I need help. No apothecary would see a worker with such an incision as mine. He lifted his arm. Infection will set in soon if it's not cleaned. Her teeth sank into her bottom lip. She glanced behind her, then back at him. She didn't even flinch at his gash, just studied it, then finally opened the door. Quickly. He stepped into the room, and she closed the door behind her. Then she slipped past him, barefoot, and motioned to a bench. Have a seat. Thank you. I can pay you for your help. She waved that off. Save the food for your family. He lifted an eyebrow. He'd expected something so selfless from her after all he'd seen her give away on the streets, but it still startled him to hear it. You are very giving. Vittoria didn't look at him again, but a half-smile lingered on her lips. She moved toward a basket filled with discarded linens. When I can be, I like to be. I can't promise you'll be healed. She cast a quick glance at his arm. Workers come to me because I have access to soap, hot water, and old cloths, which is rare enough, but not because I can heal anything. I know no healing incantations or magic. But you help. Their eyes met for a moment, though she turned away. He felt her gaze all the way to the bottom of his toes. For the last week, she'd unknowingly commanded all his attention. He couldn't stop thinking about her. He'd given thousands of food buckets away over the last 10 years, and never had someone shared so much of what they received. They took it home and ate it over several days, or tried to eat it all at once and made themselves sick. But Vittoria was different. Tonight, she'd receive her 7th bucket, but this one would refill itself at least 3 times. Zuri had all the food ready for him to transport into the bucket with a spell, because not even landowners could conjure food that satisfied hunger and nourished the belly. He had little doubt Vittoria would reserve some for her family, then give away all the rest. Still, he'd test her, because if she started to keep it, and who could blame her, then he'd know she wasn't the one. But oh, how he wanted her to be. Vittoria worked steadily as she prepped a few old rags and grabbed a potion from a glass bottle over the hearth. "Your name is Vittoria, yes?" She nodded. "You are becoming known for your charity? There are 2 witches outside waiting for you to finish your work here." To his surprise, a wry smile filled her face. "Yes, they are my friends. I've known them for many years. They're hungry and unable to work. Who can blame them for waiting?" She motioned to his cut as she approached. "This potion will sting." He shrugged. "Where do you get the food to be so generous?" She hesitated. Kind landowner." It required all his considerable concentration not to react. A kind landowner? He was the legendary La Salvatorra. To the workers, a giver come to life, and to the landowners, a pesky gnat that needed swatting. She knew what his sign was and who gave her the food. She thanked him for it every day. A landowner? He fought off the initial insult with a smile. "How fortunate." Her gaze darted to him, then back to his wound as she dribbled a little potion over it. Had she sensed some tension in his voice? "It's not like that," she snapped. "I don't sell my body to him." "I never imagined that." The potion frothed over the blood, so she quickly put a warm, wet cloth over the top of it and applied a little pressure with the weight of her hand. The cut stung for a moment. "Well," she chewed on her bottom lip. "To be truthful, it's La Salvatorra that leaves the buckets. He has been leaving them for me for over a week now, and I don't need all that food, so I share." "Ah!" His face lit up. "Who else? He is a very good man." She rolled her eyes. He fought not to choke. Had she just rolled her eyes? You do not like the legendary giver?" he asked in a strangled voice, failing to affect a casual air. She had the moxie to appear amused. Call him arrogant, but he'd earned at least a little recognition after all the years sacrificing his food, his safety, and his name to the streets. Mateo lived in a world of in-between, born of nobility, living among workers. He claimed neither side, because how could he? He straddled the middle because at least the middle would have him. When he was La Salvatorra, he felt all that slide away. "La Salvatorra is not a bad witch," she said slowly. "A bored landowner, I would imagine, with wealth and time to spare. At least he has a conscience, or maybe he just loves danger." "He does something, at least." Her nose wrinkled. She shrugged with one shoulder. "Maybe, but he's not very effective, is he?" Mateo swallowed hard. This girl and her opinions. "Effective," he cried. "Think of the lives he saved." "You are a friend of his." He grinned. "I could only be so blessed." Her eyes rolled again. "I'm amazed," he said, unable to hide his astonishment. "He gives you food to spare, and you speak badly of him." "No." She unwrapped the bandage. "Not badly. I am grateful for the food he's given to me, my parents, and my nephew, but—" She trailed off, clearly lost in thought as she obtained another bandage, soaked it in a cauldron of steaming water, and returned. When she mopped up his arm, she frowned. "Yes?" "I just think that La Salvatorra is a bandage over a festering wound. He hands out food to witches who will just need more the next day. We are still hungry. We are still workers. We are still uneducated." Mateo let out a long breath. She winced. "Does it hurt a lot?" "No, it's fine," he croaked. He couldn't even feel the cut, but his pride stung. Never in the last decade had he ever stumbled on a worker who didn't love La Salvatorra. He didn't need to be thought of as an almost god. Givers were the next closest thing. But all the other workers held his name in reverence. Vittoria? She'd cast it out with the washwater if she could. There must be some explanation. "Do you believe in the givers?" he asked. She hesitated. It was his turn to sound amused. I take that as a no. It's not so simple as that. Givers are supposed to be more powerful than witches. They're supposed to be benevolent and watchful over workers. But La Salvatorra has not given justice. Not truly. Because we are still oppressed. She shrugged. How can the givers be real if not even La Salvatorra has saved us? La Salvatorra, if he is a giver, is a disappointment, which means the givers can't be real. That means that La Salvatorra is a landowner with a conscience. Astonished, Mateo could only stare at the floor. Of all the things he'd expected her to say today, none of it was that. His mind spun. What could be said? Vittoria made several points, good points, points that he'd never heard or considered before. Fair, he said, his voice barely moderated. She didn't worship the givers, at least. That was one point in her favor regarding his whole plan. But could she be trusted? That's what he'd set out to prove. For some reason, he felt he could trust her more than ever now. She softened her words with a gentle smile as she wrapped a white bandage around his arm. She looped it back around, then tied the two ends together. With a nod, she motioned to the door. You may go. He stood. Should he reveal himself to her earlier than planned? In spite of her attitude toward La Salvatorra, or perhaps because of it, he decided it was time after all. Thank you for your help. May I give you some food? No, save it for yourself or your family, or give it to one of the witches outside. But thank you. No, I must insist. A bucket appeared on the floor, this one with a lighter color and wider girth than normal. Twice as much food as he'd ever given her filled it. There wouldn't be room enough in her pockets. She'd have to carry the bucket, which is what he wanted. Witches needed to see her with it. Her eyes widened as he whispered the ancient spell for the sign of La Salvatorra. His symbol appeared seconds later. Vittoria gasped. Then she glared at him. You, she cried. You are La Salvatorra. He reinitiated the rotating magic so his appearance would change. As his features eased into something else, she took a step backward until her back collided with the table. Her face had gone pale. He held up a hand. Don't worry, Vittoria. I won't hurt you. Her spine snapped straight, shoulders back. I'm not afraid. I'm annoyed. She meant it. She didn't appear to be scared. Instead, she looked livid. You let me speak so openly about you, she hissed. What, are you spying? Following me around? Why are you giving me buckets? She faltered, then softened. I didn't mean to disrespect your work, but I won't take back what I said. He grinned, truly amused now. You made fair points, Vittoria. I wouldn't want you to take it back. I need the truth. It did surprise me, he added candidly with a wink. No one has ever hated me before. She bristled. I never said I hated you. Mateo smiled, but she recoiled a little. What must his expression look like? He'd grown slightly in stature, and a thick belly protruded beneath his shirt. Great. She'd be highly impressed with this. Mateo brushed that off. Would you continue to distribute the food buckets? For the last 7 days, I've hoped and assumed you would, but I realized perhaps we would both benefit from an agreement. He let out a long breath. What you're doing is possibly the most important work I've ever done. Her mouth bobbed open and closed. You want me to keep giving away your food? Yes. Why? Mateo hesitated. There would come a day when he would lay the whole plan at her feet, but not yet. Not until time proved out his theory. Not until all the workers in Necci recognized her face. Because I fight for justice, he said quietly, even if it doesn't seem like it. You're right, the system is broken. La Salvatorra was never meant to save, but to help. The reputation created itself. But know that I am working for more. To change things, I mean. Will you trust me, Vittoria? I have set things into motion that will set workers free if you will help me with it. All you have to do is what you're doing now. Her voice faltered only a moment before she nodded. Yes, I will distribute your food. And I will keep you safe in return. You won't see me, but I'll escort you to and from your jobs and as you seek work. That's it. I will not be stalking, watching, or following. Just protecting. Her shoulders relaxed. When her eyes darted over his face, then his chest, He realized the magic had changed him again. Understanding dawned. "I will never know you, will I?" "Never," he murmured. "Is a long time. Soon, Vittoria, I'll reach out again. Until that time, distribute the food and help wherever you can. Somehow, we'll find ways to get you what is needed. Food, medicine, bandages, blankets. We have access to all of that, at least some of the time. I'll be protecting you, so if you need something, just be obvious about it somehow." 1,000 questions seemed to fill her gaze then, but Mateo nodded once and transported away before she could ask them. For now, he needed her to focus and her face. The rest of the plan could be set in motion behind the scenes. For the first time in years, Mateo felt hope. 2 months later. Mateo's transportation spell delivered him to the beach. Only a second passed before he regathered his wits. Transporting had always been disorienting, and took in the scene before him. Ocean waves crashed with a gentle hiss. 2 men stood a few paces away, staring at him. Mateo's stomach lurched. He hadn't spoken directly to them in years. So why had they called him here today? They knew his plans, ignored him as he flittered around Necci, speaking to landowners and workers alike, acted as if he didn't visit the farms, the orchard, the balls and landowner houses that would welcome the estranged son. In the distance loomed Magnolia Castle, the jewel of the Eastern Network. They'd chosen a spot north of Necci and not far from the Saltu jungle, where neither workers nor landowners ventured. A giant rock stood in the middle of the ocean like a gray thumb. Wind had worn a hole through the middle of it that the landowners called the Griso Petra, the hole of the first life. They believed that souls who departed the Eastern Network with honor left for their next life through that hole. A wizened old man with back and shoulders hooked like a question mark glared at Mateo. His beady black eyes cut as sharp as diamonds. "Per," Mateo said with a brittle smile. He wanted to rub the sleep out of his bloodshot eyes, but he didn't dare. A rebel riot had kept Mateo, Benot, and his men out in Necci for longer than usual. Vittoria had also left for her job early, which had prevented him from getting any sleep before this meeting. "Mateo," said Per in a gravelly voice. Per, the high priest Hode, once stood at a strapping height comparable to Mateo's. Now he was hunched over to half his usual size. "Power," Mare had once said. "Hode is embodied power." Time had dealt Hode a cruel hand. The old man's eyes didn't contain any less venom despite having to glare up at everyone, his neck kinked at an awkward angle. He had long white hair tied away from his face and cold brown eyes. If such a thing were possible, his deteriorating health had only made him more wrathful. "I'm dying," Hode declared. The words issued from his mouth like a blighter. Mateo blinked once. His gaze slipped to his younger brother, who stood at Hode's side. Romeo was gentler in features than Hode, but not by much. Romeo said nothing. Hode's declaration wasn't entirely shocking. His health had been in decline for years. But still. Mateo schooled his expression. "Allo to you as well, Per." "The apothecary says I have no more than 3 months." Hode pressed his lips together and tried to draw in a deep breath, but he failed. His health had forced others to take over much of his work. Romeo, Balta, others on the council. Though once a man of power, he was little more than an old man waiting to die. "And what do you think?" Mateo asked. "Are you dying?" Hode's gaze pierced him. "I have long enough to make sure you don't succeed me." Mateo smiled. "The 3rd assassination attempt made it clear you don't want me on the throne. No need to reiterate." Hode scowled, no doubt still peeved about the foiled plots. "Per." Romeo used a spell to conjure a padded wooden chair. "Your seat." There was no warmth in Romeo's care, and there never had been. Though Mateo and Romeo shared a sour distaste for Hode, they'd only spoken intermittently over the last 10 years. Mare's death when Mateo was 14, and Romeo 11, had fractured whatever brotherhood they once had. Romeo resembled their deceased mare, Esperanza. Brown velvet eyes, thin shoulders, and a once bright smile. Mirth certainly didn't follow Romeo, but prosperity did. He resembled a gentle rabbit, not a hardened leader. He had the same broad stance as Mateo, though he stood several hands shorter. He wasn't outgoing or confident in the same way, but held a stern intensity that Mateo appreciated. Romeo had always been a hidden surprise. With his sharp mind, he would make a perfect head of guardians. But Romeo wanted more than that. Romeo wanted to be High Priest. He wanted to take over Hode's position, negotiate a long-term peace with the other networks, make no changes to the social structure, and protect the precious landowners who stood behind him, at any cost. Mateo, on the other hand, filled a doorway with just his shoulders, like Per once had. He was quicker to engage with people and fast with strategy. He smiled at the right times, and then a little bit more, so witches reluctantly liked him, even landowners. He wanted to change everything about the social structure, and already protected the workers who'd started to rally behind him. The two had always been different. "Mateo," Romeo said as Hode settled into the chair. "Allo." "Allo, brother," Mateo murmured. "It's good to see you." And he meant it. Once upon a time, he'd adored Romeo as his little brother. They'd caught frogs and wreaked chaos together. "I assume you've heard the rumor about me invoking the law of rights now the pair is dying," Romeo said. He held Mateo's gaze without a sign of remorse. There was no rumor, of course, but Romeo always loved throwing witches off. He loved control, just like Hode. At the words, law of rights, Mateo's stomach clenched again. He kept his face impassive. As the eldest son of the High Priest, Mateo should rule by law when Hode died. Except no landowner wanted the wild son, who was sympathetic to workers and banned from the castle, to ascend to power. No, they wanted the son Hode had chosen. They wanted Romeo, the son they knew because Hode had flaunted him, trained him, possessed him for the last 10 years. The son who wanted to dutifully follow in Hode's bloody footsteps. Except for that pesky law that Romeo couldn't just have it while Mateo was still alive. Romeo, the beloved of both their parents, could contest Mateo's ascension through the law of rights. Once it was invoked, Mateo and Romeo would have to survive a series of tests. The winner, the only one alive at the end, gained the throne. The law of rights meant Mateo would have to kill Romeo to win, something Mateo had never been okay with. Of course, High Priest had overturned old laws before, but this was one Hode couldn't erase. Just enough landowners on the council insisted it be upheld as a matter of future security, and they loved their entertainment and bloodshed. If there was anything the law of rights guaranteed, it was bloodshed. Mateo was mostly unknown in the landowners' world. Some of them knew him. Some of them had him over for dinner and tolerated him and his progressive ideas. In their thinking, Romeo was beloved like a god. Mateo had no chance of winning, so why erase the law? He'd prove them wrong. "The law of rights, yes." Mateo's lips twitched in a half-smile. "So you threaten to invoke it?" "It's not a threat." "I assumed not. I plan to initiate it shortly." "It's your right." Romeo studied him with an openly curious gaze. "You'll never win, Mateo," Hode said. He peered up and tried to straighten his spine, then grimaced and gave up. "Your faith in me is appreciated, Per." "I'll give you this last chance to back down and keep your honor," Romeo said. "Are you still determined to ascend to the throne?" "Yes." Romeo ignored him. "We'll set you up with a house, a stipend, and as many witches as you desire to keep you company. You'd want for nothing. Just sign the throne over to me and save yourself from the tests." When Romeo invoked the law of rights, he would initiate a series of 3 tests. The test of courage, the test of magic, and a fight to the death against each other, with no weapons or magic. Fists and hands only. Last one standing took the kingdom. Each test was spaced apart by several weeks to allow recovery, if the participants survived it all. "I'm not afraid of the tests," Mateo said. "You will die, Mateo," Romeo replied coldly. "Not to mention how poorly prepared you are for leadership. The rebels were on the verge of anarchy. They want to destroy every member of our family, kill the council and all male landowners, and install their own leader. The Central Network threatens the border. So what is your plan? To liberate the workers and break the spine of our country. What if the Central Network attacks? What if the rebels take over Netchi? How could you possibly know what you're doing?" Mateo hid a flinch. He didn't hate Romeo for invoking the law of rights against him. When Per took Romeo away, Mateo knew this day would come. Mateo would have invoked it too, were he in his brother's position. But he did hate Romeo for assuming so little of him. No, he hadn't been wasting the 11 years since Mare died. He'd worked harder than Romeo ever had to. He learned the same magic, read the same books, fought the same fights, traveled the same roads. only he did it alone. He survived in the streets even though Hode had cut him off. In that time, Mateo had learned the grimoires, the laws, the ancient texts. He'd visited every coven in the network, met the high witches, and discussed their needs. He found landowners, dined with them, talked politics, attended a very few social events with the landowners who lived on the fringes of society, the ones that most didn't care about. Romeo knew all of that. Still, he discounted him. "I have no plans to die, Romeo. Your concern is appreciated." Romeo said nothing, but his stony silence gave him away. Whenever he'd been annoyed as a little boy, he tightened down like a clam and then exploded later. Was it the same way now? Mateo's thoughts spun out, but he curbed them. He could think of Romeo later. "Even if, by some miracle, you kill me in the match," Romeo continued, "there's the question of whether the landowners will follow you." "If they have no choice, they'll do it gladly." Romeo scoffed. "So you'll incite civil war to satisfy your need for power? You'll turn against the landowners who control this network." "You think the landowners could fight?" Mateo scoffed. "They can't even do their own laundry." "You underestimate their magic," Romeo muttered. Mateo hesitated for the first time. That was the weak spot, wasn't it? With an adequate magical defense, the landowners could potentially hold out for a while, try to form a splinter government and rule themselves. But for how long? They needed the workers. Mateo could outlast them. "There is no way you could win them." Romeo waved an arrogant hand, as if that ended the conversation, as if there wasn't so much more to the situation that he just kept ignoring. The gesture was so like Hode that Mateo's throat tightened. "I suppose being banned from Magnolia Castle after Mare's death had something to do with it," Mateo muttered, unable to keep the steel from his voice. "I still can't go near it unless invited." Romeo acted like he hadn't said anything. "You're too much of a wild card, too sympathetic to the workers. You'll do nothing but destabilize what we built." Mateo clenched his teeth. He didn't want the Law of Rights, didn't want to fight Romeo, but he also didn't want Romeo on that throne. Somehow, he'd have to come to terms with what he had to do. "When you invoke the Law of Rights," Mateo said softly, "then I will accept it. But know that I'm willing to discuss other paths. I don't want to take your life, Romeo, but if I have to, then I will." Hode laughed, a wheezy, crinkling sound, like tearing onion skin. "Oh, Mateo, how you will fall in this world. Foolish boy. I'm ashamed to call you mine. No more discussion. You had an opportunity to retreat and rejected it. Your death is your own, and you will die without honor." Mateo ignored him, but couldn't stop the twinge in his chest. The words were nothing new. The sentiment was as common as the sea air. But still, the reality stung. Per would never approve. He'd chosen Romeo as the son to groom for the High Priest's throne because Mateo thought for himself and couldn't be controlled. Hode didn't like anything he couldn't control. Fortunately, Mateo wasn't planning to reform the network for Hode's benefit, but for everyone, even for Romeo, though he'd never understand. Mateo clenched his fists at his side, fighting the sudden thrum of rage that slipped through him. Judgment, cool and crisp, filled his brother's eyes. His brother, who had lived in the lap of luxury, who had the approval of their only remaining parent. "You can expect my announcement shortly." Mateo nodded. Understanding the patterns of Romeo's mind had never been his strength. Unfortunate, but true. Hode hacked a cough, jolting Mateo from his thoughts. When Hode calmed, he looked at Mateo and said nothing. "Then I shall go." Romeo cast one last pointed gaze at his brother before he transported away. Hode left without a word. Mateo stared at the sand where they'd disappeared, the gentle hiss of the ocean at his back. Questions swirled through his mind. Was Romeo truly in Per's lap? Had the years with such a hard man not jaded him? Romeo would have seen Hode's constant deceptions and manipulations, while Mateo saw the oppression of the workers. Had Romeo shut off his compassionate, loving side over the years with Hode? Those couldn't have been easy years. Mateo had wished daily that he could have saved Romeo from their pair. He didn't think he misunderstood the quiet hatred he felt from Romeo, for Mateo and for Hode. Romeo hated Hode just as much as he did. At least they had that in common. But Mateo would be a fool if he didn't assume Romeo affirmed Hode's vision for the network. Romeo loved the landowners, had a strange affection for Nechi and all its quirks. He'd protect his witches, even at the expense of the workers, just like Hode wanted him to. Mateo would at least be willing to try to help both landowners and workers. His mind fluttered back to Vittoria. So far, his plan the last 2 months had worked quietly and smoothly. Workers had come to anticipate Vittoria, to know her in the streets, to call to her, flock to her. Mateo drew in a cleansing breath, letting his thoughts run for a minute. Release. A sensation of letting go slipped through his body, easing his tense back and arms. He thought of Romeo's lack of belief in him, his skepticism. Release. With another sharp breath, Mateo rolled out his shoulders. Time to get some sleep. Then he'd accept Romeo's invitation to compete under the law of rights and prepare himself to kill his brother.